Well, welcome back to another Coach's Chat. Today we have a really interesting topic to cover, and one that we've been seeing kind of come up quite frequently within the community, having clients ask questions around the topic, but also just conversations, out there on social media and whatnot, in general about how to approach, your nutrition with children. So your own nutrition and your children's nutrition, and how to kind of how to approach that, how to avoid, any negative thoughts, feelings, actions around food, activity as well, I think is a good one to cover too. So the entire purpose of this podcast, right, is to address issues, questions, concerns that we see frequently coming up over and over again within the community. So we decided to tackle this one today. We have some specific questions from community members, but oftentimes we don't even need those to keep the conversation going when we've got Ben on the podcast. So excited to dive into this. I think a main one, or the main kind of topic question is, it's almost taboo to talk about food and diet and all that sort of thing, but around children, right? Because we don't want to necessarily put any negative feelings, negative connotations around the topic, but then without talking about it at all, how are children supposed to learn, right? So I think it's a difficult balance, and something that, maybe we overthink, but hopefully we'll be able to bring some clarity to the subject today.
Yeah, so I guess the biggest answer is, well, if you're not talking about it, kids are still going to learn, and they're probably going to learn by the example that you're demonstrating, right? So,
and on that note too, if you're not teaching them, or if you're not talking about it,
someone else is.
Other people are, right? Like other kids in their schools, or on the YouTube videos they're watching, the social media that they're getting involved in. So I think that's, a very important point to make too.
Yeah, maybe park them in front of our YouTube or social media bag, so at least what they're learning is kind of like verified. I think that's a really good point to start on. And we're not going to really focus specifically on, RDA recommendations of what children need, right? We're going to talk a little bit more peripherally and sort of talk more about actions and behaviors. And probably the biggest one that comes up is the examples that you set right now, kind of what we're alluding to. If you're not having conversations about challenging subjects, right, of any means, not even necessarily just food and nutrition, but those conversations are still going to be had, and kids' biggest influences are generally their peer group. So if no one's informing their kids, and kids are getting informed or getting information from somewhere, then that's probably the first kind of step down the wrong path, right? We often get questions about parents who track, and whether they're weighing and measuring their food and things like that, and whether those kind of behaviors are appropriate for teens in particular. I wouldn't know. Like, I don't think kids under 16, probably 15, 16 should even really have an iPhone and really be in that kind of. That's a different conversation, but I think with everything that we're going to talk about, what we need to understand is that context matters, right? And for some people, weighing and measuring and tracking can be super triggering and super obsessive, and it's not a really good tool to try to teach them about nutrition, right? But on the other hand, like, I don't know anybody who has an issue with weighing and measuring and tracking when they're following a recipe or making a cake, right? So again, like, context is very important. But probably the biggest thing that comes up when we talk to, on the podcast with child psychologists and stuff like that is, you need to do your own healing first. If you're someone who has huge issues with food, a terrible relationship with food, not a lot of understanding with food, if you don't look to address that within yourself, that's something that you're probably going to pass on, right? Mm-hmm. Because the kind of, examples of behavior that your kids will see is like, what's your expression when you get on the scales every morning? How do you talk about your body and yourself? And what steps are you taking to set an example that's, body positive and health focused, and demonstrating active lifestyle and balance, and encouraging conversations around self-worth and relationships with food and things like that, and what constitutes good, not good or bad, but more progressive choices, healthier choices. It's hard to do that if you don't really know, right? So probably the biggest thing you can do when it comes to educating your kids is start by really educating yourself. I think there's a bit in there too that, like, if you've decided necessarily that specific foods aren't things that you want to eat because you're working to improve your health, then why would you want your kids to eat that sort of stuff too, right? I think generally speaking, a more simplistic approach, can be beneficial. It's not that you're not, allowed to have chips or pizza night or whatever else, but there's probably conversations we had there around, look, these foods are sometimes foods, and these other foods are foods that we eat more often. And if that's just the way we eat, there's probably not a whole lot of like fighting or explaining or anything like that goes on. And trouble probably starts when you try to break already existing habits. That's probably where the battles lie. But yeah, I think probably the most important thing to kind of take away from all the strategies and all the questions we're going to answer today is ultimately your kids are going to follow the example that you set. So if you do have some unresolved, healing, or some healing that's required when it comes to your relationship and your food practices, it's probably the first place to start, right? And if your kids are young adults or teenagers, I think that I would actually encourage a conversation about that with them. If you're going to make some big overhaul lifestyle changes that you want them to be involved, I think it's okay to sit down and have conversations with your children about, look, mom or dad is needs to start taking their health a bit more seriously. And part of the things that we need to do in order to do that is make sure that we're eating more of the right foods and that we're being a little bit more active. And, I think it'd be fun for us to go down to the park and kick the footy or throw a ball or go for a walk or whatever it is. Right.
And I think, yeah, in that, finding ways, whether it be nutrition related or activity related, to ensure that what you're doing, what you're eating is enjoyed by all, right? So you're not force feeding your child broccoli because it's a vegetable and they need to be eating broccoli, but maybe experimenting with your child too, being like, okay, what vegetables do you like? Like, what are your favorites? Like, let's try some new colors. Let's see, maybe we want, X amount of colors on your plate rather than we don't want this on your plate. I think too is one way to approach it.
Yeah, well, picky eaters tend to have or raise picky eaters, right? And it's not necessarily that we're born picky or we're born with a limited palate as such, but it probably comes down to more of, well, how many of these different textures and flavors and colors have you been exposed to before you start to realize you're making your own food decisions, right? I think that's something that we've tried to be super conscious with Matea, because for convenience sake, I am usually quite happy to just have like the same meal over and over and over again, just to kind of to make things easier in terms of time. But we're also, if we're going out to different restaurants or at different family occasions, like now that she's on solids, like Matea will eat what we eat, right? So we've got this great clip of her just like gnawing on the end of like a char-grilled octopus tentacle, right? And it's like I needed to try octopus as much as like it's a different texture, it's a different flavor, she can hold it. And especially when they're kind of around the year mark, she's not really eating a lot of the time. It's more just like mapping the mouth and teething on everything, right? But if you're giving them that exposure to a lot of different things, different colors, kind of let them make that decision for themselves, right? And obviously, I think that there's always going to be hesitation to expose your kids to things that maybe you don't like to eat or you don't like to cook, right? So probably being wary of unintentionally limiting that kind of exposure to different things is another thing to keep an eye out for.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's probably premised that we're kind of flipping back and forth here between like young kids and then like young teens and then like young adults. And obviously there's going to be different context for each one of those groups, right? So like we said before, if you're 14, 15, it's probably not necessary in any regards for you to really be on MyFitnessPal. But if you're 16, 17 and you're a teen athlete and you're trying to qualify and go to the games and you're working with different coaches and you're training and you got a scholarship to the AIS or you're a weightlifter, blah, 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 then obviously the context might change quite quickly as you get to those kind of levels, right?
Mm-hmm. What about, so kids who, are in that age range where they are growing quite quickly. Say for yourself, Ben, when you were like 8 years old and probably growing pretty quickly, I think kids, what you can often see is this like inability to fill them up, right? Like they always just want to be eating. And, as a parent, how do you kind of gauge, okay, when are we becoming overeating, and when do I need to like step in, or when do I just need to, or do I just need to let them kind of do what they're going to do? And yeah, any insights there?
Yeah, I think again, we kind of look in adults when we're talking about like behavioral triggers that might set adults off into things like binge episodes and stuff like that, right? Or restriction episodes. And a lot of what causes that for most people is like stress. It's an emotional response. It's a comfort response. So when it comes to definitely binging and restricting, it's a lot more to do with the emotional reaction to an obstacle or a challenge more than it is the actual action itself or the food that we're choosing to eat, right? So kids are very good at regulating appetite, right? They don't yet interpret general stress and how food can be working as a comfort, right? As a trigger. So and they're also super active, right? And so they're always running around. They're, playing 10 different sports. It's hard to sit still. You can't keep up with them. So for the most part, as they get older as well, if they're quite active and they're hitting puberty and they're growing, whatever else, they're going to be at a level where their expenditure is going to be quite high without having yet learned to comfort eat or to binge. And especially if you're minimizing the amount of processed food that's in the house, we're also less likely to be triggering like mass sessions of eating based purely off like chemical engineering, right? So again, like I've never had a client come to me and break down because they're binging on fruits and vegetables, right? Like it just doesn't happen as much as it will like chips or lollies or ice creams. Okay. So if your kids are hungry, I would argue that, definitely in the younger ages, that hunger is going to be legitimate, right? They're also not at an age where they recognize, oh, it's 1 p.m., it's lunchtime, so I'm learning to be hungry at this point. So if they're coming in hungry at night, it might be worth like, understanding they probably haven't eaten much because they're always constantly distracted when they're at daycare or kinder or school. And maybe they get home and they haven't really had a chance to sit down all day and actually have a proper intake of food, right? So for young kids, and obviously like everyone's different. And if weight management is an issue early on, it probably is more to do with like, what foods are your kids choosing to snack on and eat? And if they're super high density, calorically dense foods that have super, low volume, that's where you're going to get into trouble with kids, just like you do with adults, right? But if like kids are coming in and you've got fruits, vegetables like carrots, capsicums, cucumbers, like different kind of colors, different fruits, and they want to have a snack and they're eating like raw vegetables, like how much do you think they're going to eat before they really get into trouble, right? And if they're going to eat a kilo of carrots, like bravo, great job. So yeah, I think, it's probably worth noting there that when we're talking about like weight management issues, we need to be conscious that some choices are going to be much more calorically dense than they are for volume, right? So if you're giving kids majority of the time good, wholesome, unprocessed foods, they're going to hit that kind of volume level of satiation before they really blow out their calories, right?
And I think one thing to touch on here too is the idea of, okay, we're talking about quality, right? Kind of quality of the food that you have available for your kids is kind of utmost importance. The same way that we talk to our clients in our community about integrating, those foods that we love, like ice cream and pizza and things like that on occasion. I think it's important to approach that with your kids the same way that we kind of coach to approach that with our clients. And really trying to stay away from that being like a reward system, which I think
for sure.
is really common. I know for me, it was common like growing up and I turned out fine. So it's okay. But I think, that is something that I remember from my childhood. It's like, okay, you do well. I think it was whenever I would go to piano or whenever I'd practice piano, because I hated practicing
As
piano,
a bribe.
I would get McDonald's. Yeah. And I think that's a dangerous kind of territory to trot on.
Well, for sure. And I think when that's the relationship that you have when you are a child, like it's very easily becomes like an adult behavior as well, right? And that's kind of, you do difficult things and you reward yourself. I mean, we have this quote all the time. It's like, hey, you're not a dog, right? Like when my dog does tricks, I reward her with like liver snacks because that's how I'm going to teach her to do things I want her to do. But like, you're not a dog, right? So stop rewarding yourself with food. You know, you can eat whatever you want, make the choices, but understand that the choices you make are going to impact the goals that you're kind of working towards. So, you know, I should also probably just, put on the record that some of the conversations that we're having, like, is kind of what I've seen and what I've observed working with clients who have kids, and strategies that we've seen work, and things that we've kind of read on a theoretical basis, right? Like, I don't have a 4-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old that I've yet been able to kind of live through these experiences. But you have to kind of be aware, like, of that kind of, and sometimes, geez, like even now it's like, oh, I just want like half an hour of like quiet, like whatever it takes, you know. Even now with Natea, like sometimes if I'm trying to do meal prep or whatever else, and she's kind of getting a little bit whingy, like she loves Vegemite. So if I really just need like 10 minutes with both my hands, I'm gonna give her like half a rice cake with a little bit of Vegemite because she loves it, you know. But she's also, for the most part, like we are trying to set some behaviors where, like, if we're sitting down to eat, she's in the high chair, we're kind of serving Kat and myself and Matea, and we're kind of all eating as a family, right? And so trying to be quite cognizant of doing those things quite early on, I think, can be super beneficial. But
so how would you approach, like, with a young teen, a treat? I don't want to say treat meal, but like with, ice cream or pizza or whatever it may be. That's one of those foods that's like a not so often food. But wanting to like celebrate with a nice like that, or order in Chinese or whatever it may be. And like, build those traditions and stuff like that I know were a really important part of my childhood. But separating that from being a reward or that type of meal.
Well, I guess if it's a one-off thing, if your child's going to another child's birthday party, like it breaks your heart, and you see it where like kids come to kids' birthday parties and like their parents have told them that they're allergic to cake or allergic to chocolate, and it's just like, now is not the time, like you're just setting yourself up for bigger battles later on. And I think if it's a one-off thing, then what are you worried about? It would be more an issue that there's obviously issues that are going on regularly during the week where like these nights out exacerbate that. And I think that, again, those are conversations you need to be having. Like, you're going out for a family birthday, like, you kind of eat what you want. Like it's with how often are we kind of doing this, right? But yeah, those are sometimes occasions, and I think it's relative to what you are doing every other day. If there's lots of rules around your house where you have things in the cupboards and things in the freezer that you're telling your kids they're not actively allowed, I think that is where difficulty is going to stem, when all of a sudden they are allowed and then it's a free for all, right? And that's more, again, of a rebellion against like authoritarian parenting, or rebellion against the rules, more so than it is like issues with hunger management or satiation, right?
And I think too, going back to a conversation I've had with you before about ice cream, right? There's a difference between keeping cheapo ice cream in the freezer at all times and having that accessible. And therefore, when children are in the mix, you're saying no, or you're allowing them ice cream all the time, right? So it's either that restriction or, free for all. Whereas if you just didn't keep that, cheap ice cream in the freezer, but you have, every week or every other week, you go for a nice, good quality rain or shine or whatever the equivalent is, for a nice, good ice cream cone. And it's just like, and it's a family event, and you're spending the quality time with each other at the same time, kind of reframing what, ice cream is, in those situations too. I think might be a tactic.
Well, I think, again, like the focus there is more on like the quality time that you're actually spending as a group, and less on like it's such a big deal that you're going to have ice cream. Right. The kids are going to like ice cream. Ice cream's delicious. Right. But again, if it's more about like, we have this joke at the moment when we go to the footy, and it's like, if the Bombers win, we get 1 scoop of Messina. And if the Bombers lose, we get 2 scoops of Messina. Right. But like
never none.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you win either way. But it's not about like going to get ice cream so much as it is like we're going as a family to the game to do something together. We're like supporting our football team, we're cheering, we're having a blast. And then it's just like something that kind of becomes a little bit of that sort of tradition, but it becomes associated with going to the footy, right? It's not every night after dinner, I now have a learned behavior and habit that I'm expecting to have ice cream post, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, I think that's going to have a lot to do with what example are you setting, you know, when you go to those family meals. Are you restricting your intake all day and not eating anything so that you can splurge and go absolutely crazy at dinner? Or are you demonstrating to your kids that like, this is a special meal because of the people that we're spending time with, and we celebrate, maybe it's culturally, maybe it's religiously, with these certain foods, but you don't need to have 8 plates just because it's something different, right? And if you've been eating properly during the day, you won't want to eat 8 plates. It's just a different type of cuisine, but you know, the amount should still be relative to whatever else is going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And same as it relates to activity too, right? Because obviously we want to promote our kids to be active, but I think what we can see, you know, in the adult community is that sometimes activity is used as punishment, the same way that, you know, food is used as a reward. And so finding that balance between encouraging your kids to be active, but not making it seem like it's a bad thing if they don't, or that they have to be active or else, you know, XYZ. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is a big one. And again, I think we're kind of, the answers to all these kind of questions, ironically, are exactly the same. It's, well, what's your relationship like with activity and exercise? And how do you express your feelings around it? Is it a chore? Is it loathsome? Are you generally like resistant to wanting to be active? Like kids are going to pick up on that, you know? And I think with activity, we want to be, you know, making sure too that, okay, we have our sports that we enjoy, but I think you may be up for a challenge if you're trying to force kids to enjoy specific sports. I think that activity in general should try to be approached like the food situation, you know, like give your kids an exposure to as many different sports as you can, and allow them and encourage them to continue with the ones that they find the most fun or that they enjoy the most, or you know, maybe that their friends do. Like who knows how kids are going to choose, right? I'm pretty biased. Like I want Matea to enjoy the football because I really like the football and I'd love to watch her play football. But at the same time, if she decides that she likes playing soccer, like I'm still going to go and kick the soccer ball with her and watch her play soccer and all the rest of it, you know? So I think being involved or encouraging your kids to be involved, and again, having that positive aspect on like, it's fun to move around and move your body and see what it can do and things like that, as opposed to like, oh, we ate a lot of food last night, we better go for a, you know, 5-hour walk today. I think is super important. And again, it comes from the example that you're setting. That's why we take Matea to every weightlifting comp and every CrossFit comp we do, you know?
And see the joy in your eyes when you're there. She can pick up
yeah. Well, I think it's very important too. You need to make it fun for kids. Like exercise for us is a prescription for health, but for kids, it just needs to be about fun. Like, so don't have expectations that they're going to A, be any good, or B, be like the next professional sports star, but make sure they're enjoying it. Like whether that's like you're kind of roughhousing on the ground around with the ball or whatever it is, it needs to, like, buy a pink soccer ball, buy a blue football, like just make it fun. If it's fun for them and they want to do it, that's how you're actively encouraging that kind of involvement to continue. CrossFit Kids is, I don't know if you've ever seen a CrossFit Kids class, but it's awesome.
Instagram videos.
Like little gymnastics, and they're climbing ropes, and they're like teaching them how to use the rings. And it's like, kids aren't going in there trying to worry about what their 7-minute AMRAP time is, you know, is going to be, or worrying about their benchmarks, but they're just like, it's fun to learn new skills. Somewhere along the lines, we forget that as adults. We become terrified of things that we're not good at. I'm not sure when that happens, but like, it's something like we all, you know, there's a lot of value in becoming a beginner again at something new. And kids are beginners at everything, right? They're going to fall, they're going to tumble, they're going to scrape knees. It's just part of the growing learning process. Speaking of which, I have a little visit from a mobile child who's learning to open doors now.
Soon she'll be getting into the cupboards.
That's right.
I think, you know, we've seen this common theme throughout this podcast, or throughout this podcast, obviously, is that if you're concerned about how your children are going to be, understanding nutrition or understanding activity and their behavior and thoughts around that, maybe kind of look internally first. But I also think there shouldn't be this panic of like, oh my gosh, I need to do this work on myself and my relationship with food and my relationship with my body image and my relationship with activity. And doing that work is then going to, my kids are going to see that and see that I need work. It's like, no, I don't think that should be something that you're concerned about at all, because the way that MTMM would, how we would approach working on that with you is teaching you how to have a positive relationship with all of this, right? And that's number one. Before we're, okay, you said you wanted to lose 10 pounds. Well, we're going to be getting you tracking right away, and we're going to be really strict, right? We need to build that foundation first. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Just because you may, feel that you want to or need to do that work internally isn't going to take away from what your kids are going to be seeing, right? Or impression.
Yeah. Like it's a hard one, and we've definitely like oversimplified it here. And kids are their own people, but I think that is important to understand, that like if you know that you have work to do, you got to do that work, because like ultimately, like kids will be the examples that we set and not the lessons that we try to teach them. So how can you be telling your daughters that it's very important that they love their bodies, and the way that they're built might be different to, God, I hate social media, but these like aspirations that they're holding themselves to, and having those conversations about this isn't real life and et cetera, et cetera. If like you're doing the exact same thing, and the reason like you want to lose 10 pounds, for the last 3 years is just an arbitrary number that you're choosing and you don't know why. And it's more to do with like your levels of self-worth than it is any kind of like health initiative. Right. So I think that those kind of things are really what's more damaging than, the other things. But involving kids in conversations that are, and obviously there's a time and a place, like talking to a 5 or 6 year old about like, body positivity and like, you got to be careful, I guess, how you overburden kids too early on. But I think just trying to have those, involving kids in the cooking process and involving them in being able to choose what they're cooking, like what would you like to make for dinner? And the notion of preconceived choice can work pretty well with kids too. Like, okay, we've got carrots and broccoli and capsicum. Which one would you like to cook? Or which one's your favorite? They choose between those three, right? So like you can set things up like that, but involve them. Obviously don't give them the cleaver and ask them to like hack up like your chicken breasts or chicken thighs, but kids can pour, kids can mix, like kids can be involved. They can turn on the oven, they can help you stir, whatever it is. If they're more involved in the actual like production of the meal, they're going to be way more likely to involve themselves in the partaking of the meal as well. Right. Whether that means that you have to separate all the colors on their plates with a little like plastic plate separator or whatever it is, like they're still eating. And I think that exposure over time and the involvement and the understanding of food and it's difficult. And like I said, we really have simplified it. I think personally, the goal for Kat and I with Mateo in particular, but any of our kids, is that, their diet is not essentially anything that they have to think about. This is just kind of the way that we eat. And it is, going to be more of those kind of unrefined, like unprocessed foods and more wholesome foods, and eat till you feel satisfied. And that's going to be pizza occasionally. And there's going to be big family dues, and there's going to be big birthdays, and that's fine. Right. So yeah, I think just trying to be cognizant of involving them as much as possible, but creating that environment where it's challenging to make multiple bad or multiple, not great nutritional choices because of what's available. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Environmental, like it's not really dissimilar to adults, like if you're struggling to control how you feel on certain specific foods, stop buying them, like don't put them in the cupboard if you know that once you open the box, you can't stop. And if the only thing that you really have availability to is like good, nutritious food, it's a really good way to understand if you're legitimately hungry or if this is a stress response or you're procrastinating or you're bored or whatever else it might be. Right.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's a lot easier to not eat something when it's just not around than when you're in control of purchasing said food too.
There was a fantastic James Clear quote yesterday, actually, speaking of, that I shared on my story. And it's the people with the best self-control are typically the ones who need to use it the least, right? So that is like exactly what we're talking about. It's easy to like not eat ice cream early in the day, but once you've walked past it in the freezer there 5 or 6 times and it's starting to get towards the night and you've made a whole day's worth of other decisions and you're a bit tired and fatigued, boom, that's when it gets you,
Yeah.
right?
When it's
So
built up over the day too. And yeah, like you said, you're tired.
yeah, and you're probably tired from chasing your kids around and keeping them active and keeping them involved. And now you're cleaning up the mess that's the kitchen because there's bits of broccoli and shit everywhere. But
And
yeah,
now we know how sleep impacts our appetite.
yeah, and that's another one that new parents are often dealing with too. And maybe that's a good one to touch on as well for adolescents, Mags, is that in Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, there's that whole chapter. He talks about this this issue that we have thinking that teenagers are lazy because they want to like sleep in all day, and it's actually that their circadian rhythm runs a little bit differently, right? It's on a different sort of timer on it, and that changes as they get older. But if we're trying to feed them on a timeline where, for all intents and purposes, their body wants to be asleep, like, of course, that's going to start messing around with their like ghrelin and leptin, their appetite and their satiation hormones. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but I think maybe that's a different podcast as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe we just scraped the surface here. We got the main concept out there, and we'll dive a little bit deeper in subsequent episodes. I think a good cadence for anyone listening would be to listen to this episode, listen to why the recap on Why We Sleep, which we're recording next week, and then potentially another episode on kind of digging deeper into this topic itself.
Yeah, we do have actually lined up for the podcast a couple of guests from like the Child Institute of Psychology and stuff like that. So maybe these are really good questions that we can forward onto them and get more of an in-depth answer to. But yeah, thank you to everyone who did put questions forward. It always makes coaches chats a little bit easier when the pressure's not on to come up with a 10-minute monologue.
Yeah, some good direction, and we feel it's going to be more beneficial for the community too if the questions are coming directly. So thank you. Well, yeah, thanks for this. I think this is a topic that if we don't have clients who have children, we're not often kind of exposed to. So it's another example of how we should be taking more advantage of the resources that we have, and the other clients our other coaches are working with, and making sure we're sharing those experiences as well. So thank you for your insights.
Maybe one more resource if you are interested is follow Coach Claire on
yeah.
Claire's incredible with like really getting the kids involved in the kitchen and like always throwing different recipes of how you can do like homemade pizzas and let the kids kind of like choose their own toppings and all the rest of it. So she's a really good resource to be following and is always posting a lot of like stories and recipes and how-tos on getting kids involved in the meal prep process. It's awesome.
And in the latest episode that I recorded with her as well on motherhood, we do discuss kind of her approach to tracking and more visual measuring and things like that when she is around her kids and the language she uses there, as well as when it comes to, weighing yourself on a scale and talking about activity and everything like that too. So we can link that episode below. I think it would be a good resource to kind of hop to next.
Lovely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for your time and your input. Excited to do another one very soon.
All right. Thanks, Mags.
Take care.